Hello, and welcome to the Willow Creek Wealth Management Cybersecurity Masterclass. My name is Tim Admire, and I'll be here today to guide you through a number of different important cybersecurity topics. We'll talk about things like phishing, device security, credential security, and a few different things on the Willow Creek side that we do to protect your information. Today, we're really going to focus in on the things that impact you individually. Not the things on the corporate level or the government agency level, but the tangible things that you and I can do today to better protect ourselves and our data and our information on the internet. So let's dive in. So first up, I'd like to do an introduction and take a look at cybersecurity from a 30,000-foot level. What are the threats that are out there? How have things changed? What are the things impacting you and I today? So where we're going to start on that is the evolution of cybersecurity. So if we think back 5-10 years or so, the cybersecurity threats that we talked about then were really around things like hacking. So hacking is direct intrusion into your device, into your accounts, forcibly breaking in, essentially. Everything we heard about was about hacking. So a lot of that has changed in the last 5 to 10 years because the traditional hacking approach of breaking into data servers and systems and those sorts of things, that has moved from the individual level to really be heavily focused on the corporate and government agency level. Why is that? That's because there's a lot more to gain there. If a hacker breaks into a database for a large corporation, they can get a lot more information about you and I than they can just trying to break into your computer or one of your individual accounts, which is very time consuming, can be very difficult to do, and may not really provide anything useful to them. So that shift has created a bit of a void on the individual level. So now that we don't have that traditional hacking happening as much, then how are we being attacked? So that void has been filled by what's typically seen through email phishing, other types of phishing. Phishing is probably the highest threat to us on an individual level at this point. So what is phishing? Phishing is essentially where an attacker is trying to trick us into providing information to them. 95% of the time, maybe even more, they're going for credentials, login information, those sorts of things. Because if they can get a login credential for an account of yours that's high value, they can potentially very easily get a lot of great and useful information about you. Email phishing is also really easy to do. It's easy to send out 10,000 emails as an attacker to 10,000 different email recipients. And probably a couple of those people will fall for the trick, provide the information, and then they've got the access to the accounts from there. Low barrier to entry, easy to do. That's why we're seeing so much of it. A lot of the phishing attacks are also coming out of countries like China, Iran, Russia, North Korea. Those countries have varying levels of sophistication around email phishing attacks. A lot of it is government-sponsored now. The problem with email phishing is that it works. People do actually fall for it. Attackers do get information. They do get login credentials and access to other important things of yours. So that's why it continues to grow and be a more common vector of threats to us. So there's a couple of things about email phishing that have changed recently, probably in the last couple of years. And you're probably seeing a lot of this as well. So number one is the volume of email phishing. We're seeing a lot more email phishing, especially in the last couple of years. We're seeing it here at Willow Creek. The volume has increased dramatically. I guarantee you're seeing it as well. You're probably seeing these phishing emails all the time. So volume has increased significantly, but probably the more concerning component is that the sophistication of these attacks has also increased significantly. So if we think back, what did phishing emails look like 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago? They were pretty easy to identify, right? So you could look at an email and the English would be bad, the grammar would be bad, the graphics would be incorrect, whatever it might be, you'd be pretty quickly tipped off that a phishing email was not legitimate. So what's changed in the last couple of years is that we're still seeing all those bad ones that don't work very well. We spot them easily. But now we're also seeing a growing number of phishing emails that are much more sophisticated. They take a lot more scrutiny on our part to figure out whether or not they are legitimate or not. So the attackers are getting more sophisticated. The attacks themselves are getting more sophisticated. You're getting more state-sponsored actors that are involved, that are funding some of these attackers and these groups that are doing some of this stuff. So that means that we individually have to become more and more diligent now about really scrutinizing these emails. Because if we go back to what I said before, email phishing is probably the biggest threat to us individually. So we've got to be really good there. So what I want to do now is give you some of the tools that you can use to really scrutinize these emails. A couple important things to get started though. Number one is that it's really important that you do each and every one of these 4 checks that I'm going to give you. And the reason for that is because these checks can individually be manipulated in some ways. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. But some of these things may appear okay in an email, whereas the attacker has actually been able to manipulate those in another level of attempt to try to trick you. And I'll give you some examples of that. So again, I want to make sure that we do all 4 of these things. So starting off with number 1, we really want to take a close look at the sender's information in the email. So when you receive an email, at the very top of that email in your email client, whether it's your phone, desktop, laptop, whatever, very similar setup, you're going to see the sender's name. And then also next to that, you're going to see the email address that the email came from. So the sender's name doesn't really mean anything at all. Anyone that sends an email can put whatever name they want to in that email field, in the name field. And it's just presented to you as they've entered it. So really meaningless to us in this case. The part that is more helpful, though, is going to be the email address. And it's not really the full address that we need to pay attention to at first anyway. It's the domain name of the sender. So the domain name is everything that's on the right side of the @ symbol of an email address. That's the domain. In the examples that we'll use today, I like to use DocuSign as an example. I think we're mostly all familiar with what DocuSign is. And it's pretty ubiquitous. We're using it pretty often. But DocuSign can also be a common phished email template that's used. We see that pretty often here. So we want to pay attention to that domain name. So in check number 1, we're looking at the domain name, and what we want to look for there is we want to see if that is a legitimate domain name for the sender of which this email is purporting to be from. So in the case of a DocuSign example, if DocuSign is sending me an alert that says that, hey, you need to sign this envelope to do whatever, it's going to come through in an email that has branding for DocuSign. It's going to look legitimate, most likely. It'll have a button to click in there that says sign the documents or something like that. But we want to make sure that that email actually came from DocuSign. And this same approach is applicable to any other email that you get that is, purporting to be legitimate. But in case of DocuSign, I know that DocuSign's legitimate email domain is DocuSign.net. When I go open a web browser and I go to DocuSign.net, it takes me to their actual website. So I want to make sure that my email from them is actually coming from that domain. Some of the easier to spot attacks that manipulate the email address tend to come from free email accounts. Those are really easy ones to recognize. They'll come from a domain that's, say, for example, Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, free email accounts. These are used very often as just throwaway accounts for spamming and phishing attacks. So if you see something that looks to be legit, but it's coming from a free email account, that's out the window right off the bat. That's a dead giveaway. The ones that we're seeing in terms of those that are more sophisticated now, folks or attackers are manipulating or registering domain names that look very similar to the legitimate domain name. So an example might be you get the email and you look at the domain and it comes from DocuSign, but the I in DocuSign is missing. So when you glance past it, when you're reading your email, your brain reads it as DocuSign, but it actually wasn't DocuSign's domain. They've just dropped a letter. Or it might be something like DocuSign-alerts.com or something like that. So be very careful about domains that are very similar to the actual legitimate domain name. Those can be a giveaway, especially when we're looking at email attacks that are more sophisticated. So that was number one. We're looking at the sender information, particularly the domain name. Number two, we really want to look at any emails that have attachments, and we want to look at those very cautiously. So emails that have unsolicited attachments are highly suspect to begin with. So how often do you get an email from someone that has attachments on it that you weren't expecting? Okay, maybe you went on a trip with friends and they're going to email you some photos. Or, maybe you were working with a company and they were going to email you an invoice. These are things that you expect to be receiving, right? Unsolicited email attachments are a very good way to get viruses and malware on your computer, because that's a common way that they're transferred. And B, attachments can also be used on phishing emails, much less frequently than links in emails, but they are used sometimes. And they'll be used to provide you with a fake website when you click on them. So want to just be very suspicious of emails with unsolicited attachments. That's number two. All right, so let's talk about number three. The third check that we want to do is to really take a look at the links within the email. So the link in the email, which is usually tied to a button, and it's usually going to be bright and shiny, and it's what they really want you to click on. In a DocuSign email, it's probably going to be the button that says click here to sign these documents or similar to that. The link in those emails is really what's going to get you in a phishing attack. Because like I said before, 95% of these phishing emails are trying to get you to voluntarily give up credentials to some other account. That's how they're actually going to get information from you. So they need you to follow a link that's going to take you to a legitimate looking website and then trick you into providing credentials to something else through that process. That's usually what that workflow looks like in a phishing email. So we really want to scrutinize those links before we follow them. So how do we do that? So this is going to be best done on a laptop or a desktop computer. It's possible to do it on a mobile device like a phone or a tablet, but it's a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to talk about how to do it on a laptop or a desktop where you've got a mouse cursor. So within the email, you're going to find that link that's in there. And if we've already passed the prior two checks, we're going to scrutinize this link now. So if you hover your mouse cursor on top of that link and just leave it there for a moment, on your screen will pop up the full web address, or what's called the URL, of where that link is going to take you on the internet when you click on it. It's going to be long. It's going to be a bunch of gibberish. Even legitimate links are just like that. They're long and convoluted. That fact doesn't really mean anything, but we want to, again, like we did on the sender information, key in on the domain name of where this is going. What web server is this link going to actually take me to? So often what we'll see in some of these phishing emails is that some of these domains are actually going to foreign web addresses. So an example that we saw recently was the domain name at the beginning of that URL. It wasn't like DocuSign.net like we would expect to see. It was a bunch of random letters .ru, which is a Russian website. So you want to pay careful attention to, are these your more typical .com.net, or are they maybe a foreign domain name, or are they just gibberish in there? Or again, are they something that looks similar to a legitimate domain, but not quite? Pay attention to that stuff. Because again, the links are what's going to get you. So this is really, we're getting to one of the last checks here. So pay attention to that. Now the final check, and actually one that is really kind of the first check, but number 4 on our list today is the smell test. So I go through these checks and sender information looks all right. There aren't any attachments. The link seems legitimate to me. The email feels right. But again, back to what we talked about at the very beginning, does it make sense for me to be getting this email? So number 4 is what I like to call the smell test. And that really is, does this feel right? Was I expecting to get a DocuSign email alert for documents to be signed? Was I expecting to get email, hey, something emailed to me from, someone that I trust, but it's out of the blue? That's a little bit weird. I might trust that email address and that sender, but I wasn't expecting anything from them. So this is kind of that last check where it's the sixth sense component. Does the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little bit when I kind of go through this email because something's just not quite right? So this is, your intuition is an important and powerful component in really scrutinizing these emails. So let's recap here. Email phishing is definitely going to be one of the highest risk areas for us individually. In terms of direct attacks on us. So we want to be really good about scrutinizing these emails all the time. So we want to go through our list of 4 checks, and we want to do all 4 of those checks every single time. So check number 1, we're looking at the sender information, in particular the domain name on the email address. Number 2, we want to look at any attachments, and anytime we have unsolicited attachments, that's highly suspect. Next, we want to really scrutinize any links that are in emails, because that's really where the attacker is going to try to get you. They need you to go do something in order to ask you for the credentials they want to steal. And finally, the smell test. Does it make sense to get this email? Is this something I was expecting or not? So if you do all 4 of those things every time, you're going to be in a pretty good place when it comes to protecting yourself from email phishing. Okay, so now I mentioned a few minutes ago that there are some ways that attackers can manipulate some of these 4 things that we're checking on the email scrutiny. So an example of that is what's called email spoofing. So you may have heard of it before. Email spoofing is essentially a way for an attacker to manipulate the email address that's presented to you as the sender's email within your email client. So we'll go back to our DocuSign example. So if I am getting an email from DocuSign, it looks legitimate. I'm expecting it to be from their actual corporate domain, which I know is DocuSign.net in that case. It is still possible, although fairly unlikely, but still possible, that a sender can manipulate that address and show DocuSign.net in the sender information when it comes through to you when it didn't actually come from their email server. So that's not to generate any additional scrutiny that you need to do on the sender information, but it's really to illustrate the point I made before that you need to do all 4 checks because some of these can be individually manipulated, and we want to make sure we're checking all the boxes when we go through here because that gives us the best chance of identifying any of these emails that might cause a problem for us. Next, we're going to talk just real briefly about ransomware. So ransomware isn't a huge threat for us individually. It definitely is on the corporate and government agency level. You see on the news pretty often that different agencies and companies are getting attacked with this ransomware. So what is ransomware? So ransomware is essentially a virus or malware that an attacker gets onto a network of computers and it infects all of them. And the whole goal for the attacker there is to encrypt all of the sensitive data on that company or agency's devices and then hold it for ransom. So if you give us, $100,000, we'll decrypt your data for you. Sometimes they don't actually decrypt it for you. Attackers and hackers aren't necessarily the most trustworthy people out of the gate, so that doesn't always happen. But that is the approach for ransomware. So again, seeing that more on the corporate and government agency level, less so for us individually, but I do like to let people know what it is because it does come up in the news pretty often. Some of the things that we're going to talk about here in just a moment on the device security side, those things are really going to protect us from the threat of ransomware if we were to actually get it on one of our devices. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. So while we're on the topic of phishing, we should talk about other types of phishing. Email phishing is really the primary way to be phished. That's where most of it is coming from, but some other ways are actually becoming more popular now than they used to be. The first one to talk about is text messages or SMS messages that you get on your cell phone. So this is becoming a more common way for phishing attempts to be made. The nice thing about these attacks, though, from our perspective, is that they're pretty easy to identify. So ask yourself, how often do I get a text message from someone that I don't know the number or the name associated with it, and it has a link in it, and they're asking me to click a link in it? Probably not often where that would be legitimate, right? Probably never. So those are pretty easy to spot because of those facts right off the bat. So my caution here is just to be very careful of those. Don't follow links in links in text messages that are from random phone numbers that you don't know or trust. So just be careful with those. The other one that we're seeing fairly often now is QR codes. So QR codes, if you're familiar with them, they are those little squares that are often printed at restaurants where you pull up the menu. They're printed on marketing materials or signs or even on television commercials or in emails to scan it with your phone camera, and it'll take you somewhere on the internet and provide you something. Often it's a menu, hopefully, at the restaurant, maybe taking you to a website or web page for, some product or something like that. So these, unfortunately, are now being used for phishing attacks. So we're seeing this quite often. There were a couple articles recently about this being done in restaurants where the attackers had actually printed up small stickers with a QR code on them, and they had gone into these restaurants and they had placed those stickers over the QR codes for the restaurant menus, so that when people went into the restaurant, they sat down, they needed to scan the code to get the menu, they scan it, then it goes to a website and says, we need to verify your identity or whatever and sign into your Gmail account to do that or something like that. And the website looks fairly legit and it looks like a regular Google sign-in page, but it's not. You enter your credentials in there and boom, they've stolen the credentials. Now they have access to your email account and you might not even know that you did it. So that's just one example, but it's really to illustrate the point that QR codes can be a common way or a growing way to phish information from you. So my suggestion is don't scan QR codes from any sources that you don't trust, which is probably very few. Don't scan any QR codes from emails that you get. Phishing emails are sometimes putting QR codes in there saying scan it with your phone. That's just another approach to getting you to provide information. So never do that. If you're at a restaurant and you can't get a hard copy of the menu and that's your only option, when you scan that QR code, make sure it just goes to a menu and don't provide any information. Don't log into anything. Don't verify your identity. Don't do anything like that. If you scan it and you get directly to a menu that's a PDF or something that you can scroll through, awesome. That's fine. That's not going to be a harm to your device. It's when you start providing information. So be very careful about that. All right, so the last component that I want to talk about on our introductory session here is going to be focused on identity theft. So this class isn't really focused a lot on identity theft, but I do want to make mention of it because clients often ask me about how they can try to guard against identity theft or how they can, protect themselves after something unfortunate like that does happen. The tough thing with identity theft is it's hard to entirely prevent. Sure, there are a few things that you can mitigate or you can do to mitigate it, but things like your social security number, your address, your name, contact information, a lot of those things are out there in a lot of different places and databases and those sorts of things. So if an attacker gets a hold of some of those things, it's very easy for them to start using them. So a couple of my recommendations typically on this topic. First one is there are a lot of good options out there for just monitoring your credit. Your credit is usually going to be an initial sign that something has happened, that your identity may have been stolen, someone may be trying to use it. A lot of credit card companies now, I know American Express does this, they offer free sort of credit monitoring, a lightweight version of it, where at least it gives you your credit score and recent activity. Keeping a close eye on something like that is always a good idea. That can be, again, a good first indicator that something weird is going on. There's some other options out there, things like LifeLock. I know some clients that use that and like it. Does it provide a huge amount of value? I don't know, especially versus maybe a credit card of yours that may provide some of that information already. But it's good peace of mind for a relatively low cost in most cases. So it's worth exploring. Another option, which usually is something that people will use after they've had a credit fraud or identity theft, is to actually put a credit freeze in place with the credit reporting agencies. This can be a little bit of a pain for you in the future when you do need to apply for credit or apply for something that needs to check your credit. You may not be doing that very often though, so the hassle factor may be pretty low, but you can go directly to the credit reporting agencies and put a freeze on your credit, and that won't allow anyone to actually take out new credit with your information, which can be a good safeguard. The third item that I usually suggest is looking at transitioning all of your statements for your sensitive accounts, financial accounts primarily, to electronic delivery. So most people think about mailed statements coming in your mailbox being more secure than electronic delivery because they aren't subject to things like hacking, but it's actually the other way around. So mailboxes are generally not secure. Your physical mail flows through a lot of different places. It's easily lost, and if your mail delivery is anything like mine, your mail tends to end up in someone else's mailbox pretty regularly. So that's a huge threat for identity theft. A lot of identity theft does happen through mail theft. So if you can get some of those more sensitive bank statements and those things to electronic delivery, and then if you're very good about some of the things we're going to talk about here shortly in terms of protecting your accounts and credentials, then you'll be in a pretty good place in terms of making sure that those statements are only delivered to you, only accessible by you, as opposed to potentially floating around in the mail. So if you're not already getting electronic delivery for your Willow Creek reports, for your custodial statements, for your bank accounts, credit cards, those sorts of things, highly encourage you to consider doing that. Okay, so we've covered the introduction of cybersecurity. We've covered a lot already. We've covered phishing, different types of phishing. We've covered a little bit on ransomware. We've covered some things on identity theft. But now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to take a deeper dive on a couple of components. Where we're going to start is with device security. So device security is going to vary depending on the types of devices that you use. So I'm going to keep this pretty high level, and if you have specific questions about the devices that you use, feel free to reach out to me. Most of the folks that I talk to are using Apple devices, so we're going to focus a little bit more on Apple devices today, but again, some of this stuff translates very easily over to Windows and Android as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is going to be public Wi-Fi. So public Wi-Fi, meaning the internet connection or Wi-Fi connection that you get for free when you go to places like coffee shops or restaurants or hotels or airports. Those are predominantly where you're going to find these. These are Wi-Fi networks that you sign on to without a password. They're typically unencrypted. There's often no isolation between devices that are on there. So if you're on a network with 1,000 other people, all those 1,000 people can have more direct access to the devices of the others that are on those networks. Public Wi-Fi is something that we all, tend to use here and there. Some of us more than others. A lot of it depends on if you travel a lot, if you're in airports and hotels often. Maybe you like to go and hang out at the coffee shop and do some work there. Or maybe you travel for work and you're doing sensitive work in airports and hotels. A lot of different factors here on the public Wi-Fi side. So I'm going to try to really give you a realistic look of what these threats look like, and then give you some of the things that you can do to mitigate them depending on, kind of what your threat profile, if you will, looks like. So public Wi-Fi has a couple of threats that kind of come along with it. I've alluded to both of them. One of them is that there's more direct access to your device. When you're on the same network with your device as a bunch of other people and their devices, those devices have an easier connection to each other because they share the same network, the same physical network. There's a lot of controls that can be in place that can protect devices from each other on networks, but the fact is you don't know what's in place when you sign onto a public network. So the assumption from my perspective is that none of those controls are in place. So that's threat number one. Number two is that when you're on a public network, the places that you're going on the internet and the things that you're doing are not private. So if you think back, 5-10 years ago, when I was on a web browser, browsing the web, maybe I go to just some random website, the thing to do was to look in the address bar at the top of the screen and look for the little lock icon. That meant that your traffic with that website was encrypted. So we've come a long ways on the internet in the last decade, obviously, but one of those really great things is that most internet traffic now is encrypted by default, regardless of the sensitivity of the website. That's just the way it's all done. That's indicated by web addresses that start with HTTPS for secure. Also the lock icon, which is becoming, again, less and less important because they all have it. Most web browsers now don't even show you the lock icon. They only tell you if it's not encrypted because that's very abnormal now. So that's a great thing. And what that means is that if I'm on a website transacting information, maybe I'm looking at a bank account, maybe I'm buying something online and my credit card information is passing over the internet, that information is encrypted. It means that someone is going to have a really difficult time breaking in and getting that information, which is great. Now, the thing that's not encrypted is where you're going, what you're doing, how much time you're spending on specific websites or services, and how much data you're transacting with those. So an example, you're sitting in an airport, and you're spending a lot of time on maybe some sensitive work websites or financial websites or whatever it might be, but we'll just call them sensitive websites. Someone else is sitting in another gate at the airport and they're on their laptop. They're on the same public Wi-Fi as you, and they're sitting there with some software programs that can capture all of the traffic that's going across that network. And they happen to notice that this device over here is doing some very interesting things on the network, some things that might make them be interested in some of the data that you might have on your device. So what this does is it starts to create a higher threat profile for you as a user and a device on that network, which, again, back to threat number one here with public Wi-Fi, is that there's more direct access to your device. So if you become a more interesting target and there's easier access to your device by someone that maybe has 3 hours in an airport to kill, waiting for their next flight, you can see where this stuff kind of starts to come together to be a little bit more of a threat for you. So I don't want to overblow some of the risks that I think are put out there in terms of public Wi-Fi. These risks exist, and they're the ones I just articulated. But let's be realistic here and talk about some of the things that we're doing on an individual basis, because that's really going to qualify how much risk there actually is there for us. So it's a spectrum. You've got on one end of the spectrum, you have individuals that just travel for fun, and maybe in an airport, they're checking the news and checking their email, maybe some social media, and that's it. That's what 95% of the people in the airport are doing, so you're really blending in that situation. Other end of the spectrum, you've got folks maybe like myself that travel for business, and when I travel, I'm working. And my work involves sensitive information. A lot of work does. And if those sensitive websites and the data that's transacted start to raise some flags with someone else that's on that network, well, then maybe there's a bit more of a risk there for someone like me than there is for someone that's just doing very benign things on those networks. So I think it's always good to put this in perspective. When you talk about any type of risk that's involved on cybersecurity, let's look at perspective, and let's look at things that we should be doing from a reasonable standpoint to mitigate those risks. Okay, so now you've probably had a moment to think about where you fall on that spectrum of the things that you do on these networks. So let's talk about some of the things you can do then to mitigate some of those two risks for these types of networks that I talked about. The first one is really easy, and it's kind of the default that I go to if I can, and that is don't use these networks, you don't have to. So often you have a good cellular signal, particularly in airports. Hotels can be a little spotty, a little hit or miss there. But hotels, coffee shops, you can have a pretty good cellular signal. If you can use cellular to do whatever you want to do on the network or on the internet, do it that way. A cellular connection is isolated, it's fully encrypted. Other folks on the cellular network don't have direct access to your device. That's the safest way to go. That's not always possible, but if you can do it, that's what I suggest. If you're trying to use a laptop or a tablet that doesn't have a cellular card in it, you can do a hotspot, Wi-Fi hotspot. Most cell phones and plans support Wi-Fi hotspots now, which basically is something you turn on your phone. It creates a little mini Wi-Fi network next to you, and then you connect your laptop or your tablet to that little network, and it passes the internet connection from cellular down to your cell phone and then over to the device that you have connected to it. Pretty cool. If you have a good cell signal, works really well and is a good way to go. Let's talk about when that's not an option. So if you've got to use the public Wi-Fi, my first suggestion is to do pretty benign things on there. Things like we talked about a moment ago. Check your news, check your email, check your social media. Try not to spend a ton of time on, financial websites or doing sensitive work things that might raise some flags or generate some interest by someone else on that network. Steer clear of that stuff, do the benign stuff, and you'll blend in with the rest of the people that are there. That's a pretty easy one as well. Okay, so what if I need to do sensitive things on these networks and say I'm traveling for business and I'm working. This is where things like virtual private networks come in, or a VPN. A lot of you may have heard of a VPN before. A lot of folks that I talk to have heard of them. Some may be using them, but maybe not fully understand what they are or whether they even need it or not. So let's talk just briefly about that. So a VPN basically takes all of your traffic between your device and the internet, and it encrypts all of it for you. So that privacy component of where you're going and what you're doing on the internet, that becomes obfuscated by a VPN. It encrypts all of that information for you. So that's all just useless to someone that's monitoring traffic on a network. Okay, so that's great. So if you are on that side of the threat spectrum where you're doing highly sensitive things, then a VPN is highly recommended in those situations. In fact, it's pretty much the standard now for business, travel, and work that's being done on sensitive things outside of a secured, corporate network, or a network where you control the physical security and access to that network. VPN is a great way to go in those situations. For most people I talk to, they fall on the other end of this risk spectrum, where they aren't doing highly sensitive things, or they can just not do those things on those networks and do them another time. Those are cases where a VPN isn't really getting you a whole lot. The downsides of VPNs are there's a cost involved. You have to remember to turn them on. You have to remember to turn them off. You've got to install software or do configuration to set them up. So they're a little bit of a hassle if you don't really need it. So for most people I talk to, I don't recommend a VPN. But if you are falling in different areas of the spectrum that we've talked about, or if it's something you want for peace of mind, hopefully now you've got a better understanding of what a VPN actually is and sort of when you might actually need it or not. If you do decide that you need a VPN, I do have a couple suggestions in terms of how to vet them. There's a lot of great options out there. I would not recommend using a free VPN. Things that are free are generally using your information to make money. And we don't want people doing that with our data that we're transacting that we're really trying to keep private and secure. So use a paid VPN service, and also use what I would usually call like a best of breed type service. So do your research, take a look at the options that are currently out there. The ones that are coming up most commonly in some of the articles that you'll find are probably, the better ones that are out there. So find the more common solutions and the paid solutions that go along with it. And you'll generally be pretty good if you go that route. All right, so next up, I want to talk about mobile device security. So when I talk about mobile devices, I'm referring to your phones and tablets primarily. Laptops are going to fall in a different category that we'll talk about here in a minute. But mobile devices, pretty straightforward, because newer devices, as long as you're on a device made within the last 5 years or so, straight out of the box, they're pretty good from a privacy and security standpoint. If you're using, your brand name devices and operating systems such as Apple and iOS, or, say a Google or a Samsung phone running current versions of Android, out of the box, these devices are really good. So they come encrypted with firewalls set up. These are things you can't even turn off on these devices, so you don't have to worry about them, which is great for consumers because this stuff is just ready to go out of the box. Couple things, though, that you do want to pay attention to. First off is going to be you want to make sure that any sort of passcode that you use on a device is using the longest option available. So again, we're going to focus a little bit on Apple devices here because that's what I see most commonly from clients. So on Apple devices, you have the option when you set up your passcode of using either a 4-digit or a 6-digit code. Want to make sure that you're using always the 6-digit code. Again, 2 more digits there makes that just a little bit more secure with very little change in the convenience of logging in. So you want to make sure you're doing that on all your devices, tablets and phones. The other part of that is you want to make sure you're using biometrics on these devices. So all the newer devices have some sort of biometric authentication that's available. Often that's going to be, facial recognition on newer iPhones. You're going to find thumbprint recognition on a lot of the Android phones as well, and then also on iPads. So make sure you're using some sort of biometric authentication on those devices, because that is significantly more secure in terms of logging into your device than entering a passcode. That can be, what's called shoulder surfed from you. You're sitting in a public place and you enter that passcode. Somebody can see you enter that passcode, and then they know what it is. And if they can steal your device, well, now they're in it, and now they have access to everything that device has access to. We don't want that. So 6-digit codes, and always use biometrics. Biometrics are also way more convenient. I talk to a lot of people who are not using biometrics because they've had problems with them. If you have had problems in the past, I highly encourage you to give it another shot, re-enroll in those processes within your device and try it, because it is a much more secure and convenient way to log into devices. And finally, there's some new stuff coming in terms of how we log in to things and passcodes that I'll talk about a little bit later. That are going to be dependent on using biometrics. So that really is the future. So you should try to get used to that as best that you can. Another thing I like to mention is something that came out in early 2024 on Apple devices, and it's called stolen device protection. And like I mentioned before, the shoulder surfing thing where someone can see you enter your passcode, then steal your phone, unlock it, erase all your data, and then sell your device. Unfortunately, that has become actually so common that Apple has had to come up with a solution to try to prevent it. So what they came up with is called stolen device protection, but it's not on by default. So if you're running a newer version of iOS, which you should be, make sure you stay up to date, you can go into your settings and you can actually search for and then turn on this thing called stolen device protection. It's very simple. It's not going to cause any headaches for you, and it's just a click of a button to turn it on, but it helps prevent someone that does steal your device from being able to actually unlock it, even if they only have the code. So it'll require biometrics to be used, which we want. We want biometrics to be required if someone is trying to use a passcode to erase things on your device. That's an extra layer of security. It also does some timeouts. So if the device gets moved to a different location that it isn't often at, like, for example, it's stolen and taken somewhere else, somebody can't unlock it and erase stuff for an hour. So some good safeguards have come along with that setting. So I do recommend that you turn that on. So let's talk on the device side about firewalls real briefly. I mentioned a moment ago that firewalls on mobile devices like cell phones and tablets, those are on by default. You can't even turn them off. So that's great. Laptops, different story. So I suggest that any device that leaves the house has a firewall enabled on it. So it's something you want to check on your device because it's often not enabled by default, but you want to make sure that it is on. So on a Mac OS computer, you can actually just go into settings. You can search in the bar there for firewall and just make sure it has the green dot on it. It says the firewall's on. If it's not, turn it on. That's another protection, especially if you use public Wi-Fi. It helps block some of the potential ways for someone to directly access your device on some of those networks. Good idea to turn that on. On Windows, you can also search for it in the settings under firewall. Make sure it's turned on in the security settings in there. Next up, we're going to talk about device encryption. Device encryption is a big one. It's an important one. It's also an often overlooked one. So if we talk again about our mobile devices, our phones and our tablets, those devices are generally coming from the factory, encrypted by default. You can't even turn it off. That is always the case on Apple devices, iPhones, iPads, those sorts of things. Those are encrypted by default. Don't have to worry about those devices on this conversation. Where you do have to worry about it is with laptops. So my suggestion is that any device that leaves the house should have device encryption enabled. So if your laptop leaves the house at any time, that means there's a threat of it being lost, stolen, compromised, that sort of thing. And that stuff happens all the time. You don't want someone to be able to just steal your laptop and then be able to extract your data directly off of it. We want to make that data useless for them. So something worth kind of backing up, zooming out and talking about briefly is that what we're going for on the device side is really to make your devices disposable. So we want our devices to, say they get virus or malware, ransomware, we lose them, they get broken or lost or stolen, whatever it might be, that, it's not a fun day and I might actually have to buy a new device, which isn't great, but I can still get my data back. I haven't lost anything incredibly sensitive. No one's going to have direct access to any of my data. It's not the end of the world. That's what we're trying to go for here. So that's why it's important to do all of these device things that we're talking about so we can get to that point. I call that sort of the device gold standard. We want them to be disposable. So if we go back to encryption, we want those devices to be useless to someone that may come across them, whether they steal them or whatever it might be. Maybe you just give it away or get rid of it. We don't want someone to take the data right off there. And how do we do that? We encrypt the data on there so that it can only be unlocked by you. So laptops from the factory are not encrypted by default. You have to enable that yourself. So I highly recommend you do that. We're going to go back to the Apple device example. In Mac OS, they call their encryption service File Vault. You can go into your settings, you can search for File Vault, and in there you can turn it on. It's going to ask you if you want to use your Apple ID as a recovery account for the encryption. I would say yes to that. And then just let it do its thing, and then behind the scenes, it will encrypt the device. The only change to the process then is that when you shut your computer down all the way and turn it off, and then you turn it back on, you actually have to log into the computer 2 times now, not just 1 time. So as soon as you turn it on, you'll be prompted for your password. That unlocks the drive encryption and allows the operating system to boot. Then you sign in again with your actual user account like you would have in the past. So a slight difference in the sign-on process, slight inconvenience, but huge gain in value. Windows is very similar. If you're running a Windows system, they call their device encryption BitLocker. So if you go and you search for BitLocker, you'll be able to find it in there and you can turn it on in a very similar way. Highly recommend that you do that on any laptop. Let's talk about USB drives now. So when we talk about USB drives, there's really 2 different things we're referring to. Those are those little thumb drives that you buy to just plug into your computer and put some pictures on and hand them to a friend. Often you find them at conferences or events or giveaways, those sorts of things. Then we've got the larger format hard drives that are about yay big. Those, again, plug in a similar way, but they're often used for backups or larger storage purposes. So really the threat here that we're going to talk about lies in the small USB thumb drives. So unfortunately, we're seeing more and more cases of those thumb drives being a vector for viruses and malware to devices. A couple ways that's happening to be aware of. First is that people are actually leaving these thumb drives around at different public places, especially airports. And someone will come up on them and say, oh, someone left their thumb drive here. It's a free $12 thumb drive for me. All right, I'm going to plug it into my computer. I'm going to format it and clear the data off of it. And then boom, I've got myself a new thumb drive here. Well, as soon as you plug that into your computer, it starts loading viruses and malware on it because it was just a decoy USB drive. Sounds a little crazy, but this stuff happens all the time. Another one that has come up multiple times recently is that in airports, people have actually, who apparently have too much time on their hands, have actually replaced some of the outlets in airports, where now they've kind of switched over to having a lot of USB outlets because that seems more convenient, right? People have gone in and they've switched those out, and behind the outlet cover, they've essentially installed a little USB drive. So when you plug your device in, you think you're just getting power, but you're not just getting power. You're getting other bad stuff too. So 2 things to be aware of here. First off, don't plug in any USB drives to any of your devices that you don't trust. You don't trust where they came from. You don't trust the person they came from. You didn't buy them yourself. Be very careful of those situations unless you have trust in them. Second, when you're traveling, bring the little power adapter that you plug your USB charge cable into. Don't plug your USB cable directly into wall outlets, especially in airports or where they're like standard outlets that someone could easily change out. Be very careful of those. The chances of that happening to you are really low, but it does exist. And like I say, we've seen more and more reports on the cybersecurity front of that sort of thing happening. So everybody's looking for a new way to try to attack us, unfortunately, and that's been a trend lately. So be careful of that. When we talk about devices, one of the important things on our devices is keeping them up to date, especially with security updates. So I highly recommend that you stay completely up to date on all your device updates. Most modern devices make it really easy for you to set up automatic updates. Sometimes you have to restart the device. Sometimes it takes a couple minutes to do it and it can be inconvenient. But these updates are literally giving you hundreds of security updates behind the scenes, and those are things you want and need on those devices. So don't delay them too long. Don't let your Apple updates sit around for months. Don't let your Windows updates sit around without allowing them to process and restarting the computer. Try to have really good update hygiene. Keep your computer running the best it can and protecting you the best it can. So stay up on those updates. Next up, let's talk about backups. So we talked about this gold standard that we're trying to get to in terms of our device security, and that is to make them essentially disposable. So one component of that is actually having backups of our data. So a device gets lost, stolen, whatever it might be, the data that's on that device, we want to have a good backup that we can restore so that we can get back to where we were. We don't lose sensitive things like maybe work data or photos and videos that, capture moments in life that we don't want to lose. So how do we do that? There's a number of different options. So on the Apple ecosystem, if you're using a Mac OS device, it's very simple. So Mac OS comes with a system called Time Machine, which is a built-in incremental backup system in the operating system, and it works great. The way that you do it is you basically just go online, you buy yourself one of those larger USB drives that we talked about a moment ago. Typically, you want to get a drive that's about double the size of your internal drive on your device that you're backing up. So say, for example, you have a hard drive on your device that's 512 gigabytes, common size. Then you would want a 1 terabyte external backup drive. So 1 terabyte is essentially 1,000 gigabytes. Say you have an internal drive of 1 terabyte, then you want a 2 terabyte drive. So something similar to that. So you get that drive, you plug it into your Mac, and it will come right up and it'll say, do you want to use this as a Time Machine backup drive? You say yes, you add a password so that that backup is encrypted. You want that to be an encrypted backup so that you don't just have a hard drive laying around with all the data sitting on that. So again, we want everything that's portable to be encrypted. So then from there, you just plug the device in and let it do its thing. The great thing about Time Machine is you don't really have to worry about it. You don't need to leave the device in all the time, although that is usually better if you can, but it's not required. Some people will just plug them in once a week, some people once a month. Once a month is a little bit of a stretch. My typical suggestion is once a week, and that's what I typically do personally as well. So that's Time Machine. Windows has some backup options as well. Also, a lot of third-party backup software available for Windows that you can take a look at. The important part is that you are backing up your data in some way. Some people ask me if iCloud is a backup service and if it's good enough just to have iCloud to back up your stuff. My answer to that is, first off, iCloud, if you ask Apple, is not a backup service. It's what's called a syncing service. The purpose of iCloud is to make all of your photos, files, videos, all that good stuff available on all of your Apple devices. Your iMac, your MacBook, your iPhone, your iPad, all those. Makes it seamless. You delete something on one, it's gone on the other. You take a photo on one, you can see it on all the others. Really easy. Downside of this is exactly that. So if you delete something on one, it's gone on all of them. That's not how a backup traditionally works. A backup is something, if I delete a file, I can actually go back into my backup and restore it. iCloud doesn't work that way. Now, it has some protections for recently deleted files, but those usually roll off after, say, 30 days. Backups give you access to your files from different points in time over a long period of time. That's the whole idea. So that's where things like Time Machine come in. So you want to make sure you're actually doing a good backup. Explore options that are out there. If you're on Windows, like I say, there are other options. On the Apple devices, highly recommend Time Machine. If you want to take this one step further, off-site backups are also highly recommended. If you look at typical backup methodology that folks would recommend in the industry, there's this solution that's usually called a 3-2-1 backup. That means you've got 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of media, and one of them is off-site. So there are ways to do off-site backups. You can count your iCloud backup as an off-site backup. It's not a perfect off-site backup, but it might count depending on how particular you want to be about it. Other options that are out there are solutions from companies called Backblaze. Amazon has some. Take a look at options that are out there if you want to go to kind of that next level and have those off-site backups. What we're doing there is protecting ourselves against something happening at our home or business where both the original device and the backup drive are destroyed, which obviously can happen. So that's backups. Make sure you're taking backups. If you can check that box and you can check all the others that we just talked about a few minutes ago, on the device side, you'll be in a really good place and you'll be at that gold standard point where your devices are essentially disposable, which is really what we want to achieve here. All right, the next big topic that we're going to talk about is credentials. Credentials are going to be your usernames and passwords. This is maybe the most important thing that we're going to talk about because everything that we do nowadays, services, websites, all those things are protected by usernames and passwords. And everybody's trying to get the username and password from you so they can get to your data. Hence email phishing and why it's so popular and common. So we want to be really good on the credential side of things. And I'm going to give you a lot of tips here that I highly recommend you consider implementing because this is really where the big risk is. If you've got weak credential security, then it's very easy for someone to get into your accounts. And I'll illustrate some of that for you as well. So let's start off with good passwords. And let's define what that means and where you should be. So first off, we want our passwords to be complex. And when I say complex, I mean they need to have uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. Those are table stakes at this point. Every password you create should already have those things. That's been a standard for a long time now. Next, we're going to look at length of the password. So this is by far the biggest driver in the security of a password. That's the length of the password. So to illustrate that, let's take a password, has upper, lower, number, special characters, that's 8 characters long. That password with current computer technology by brute force, which means just trying to guess the password, not using AI or quantum computing or any fancy things like that, just trying to brute force that password, it takes about 2 or 3 minutes for a computer to break it. Extend that length of the password out to 18, 19, 20 characters, and we're in the trillions, with a T, trillions of years with current computer technology to break that password. Computers are getting better and better every day. Technology continues to advance. AI is going to play a huge role for hackers trying to break into things. Unfortunately, it will be used in malicious ways, and it's going to be a huge advantage to them in breaking and cracking some of these passwords. So we need to continue to get better and better at this. So current standard and current recommendation is that every single password that you use should be at least 12 characters long with full complexity that we just talked about. My suggestion is that highly sensitive websites or highly sensitive services, such as password managers that we're going to talk about in a moment, should have much longer passwords. They should be 20 or north of that in character length. I personally shoot for 25 or more in terms of character length on a password manager because those are the keys to the castle. We want that to be really strong, and we want it to be strong for a long time. So keep those things in mind. Next, we want to talk about uniqueness of passwords. This is really important, and most people don't do this. So big takeaway here is we want every single password that we use to be different. We never want to reuse a password between two services. Let me illustrate why that's important. So what's happening commonly is that password databases are being stolen from companies. The attacker sells the database on the dark web. Another attacker buys that, and then they use that same password database against other services and accounts that are out there. Usually going to be more sensitive things like banking or, health or whatever it might be. They'll take that database, they'll run all those passwords and logins against these other databases, and inevitably they're going to get into probably thousands of them. Example, early 2024, the 23andMe breach of the genetic testing website. What it sounds like happened there was exactly what I just explained. A database was sold and purchased on the dark web. That database was run against their database, and they got into tens of thousands of accounts by doing that. So that is a great illustration of why we never want to reuse a password between two different services, because we don't want to allow someone to use a stolen password from one place on another more sensitive place. So make them unique. Fourth component of good password hygiene is going to be rotation of sensitive passwords. At Willow Creek, we rotate the passwords every 90 days on pretty much every system that we use, and we use a lot of systems. So we are changing passwords a lot. I'm not going to sit here today and tell you that that's what you should do, because I know if I tell you that, it's going to be too much work and you won't do it. So my suggestion is going to be identify the 5 or 6 more sensitive services and websites that you use. Those are typically your financial websites and your health websites. Figure out what those are. On your calendar, set a reminder for once or twice a year to proactively go in and change those passwords to a new, strong password. What we're doing here is, again, we're preventing things from being stolen and reused at a later date. If a database is stolen and your password's in it, then the purchaser of that password database can't reuse it back into that service again, because ideally you've changed it since then. A lot of this stuff sits on the dark web, doesn't get used for a while. So again, another safeguard for us in the grand scheme of things. All right, so that's what we want to do in terms of creating these very strong passwords. Okay, so now you're saying, well, Tim, how do I do this? Like, how do I keep track of passwords that are 12 or more characters long that are completely random and they're different for every service, and I use 115 different websites and services? Like, what do I do? Right now, I write them down. That's commonly what I hear. I write them down. I keep them in a file on my desktop or hidden on my computer. I put them in my contacts. Sometimes maybe you've got a scheme that you try to encode them with. Some of these are semi-effective. Most of them are very inconvenient, but generally speaking, both inconvenient and ineffective. So what's the solution? Generally, the solution is what's called a password manager. You've probably heard of them. Basically, it's a secure vault where you store all this login information on your system with a very strong password that protects that system. Like I mentioned, maybe 25 characters or at least north of 20. And then that system populates that login information in your web browser when you go to sign into one of these websites. Super convenient, super easy to use, and allows you to meet all these requirements that we just talked about. Probably the only realistic way you're going to be able to do that, especially in a convenient way. And we have to do that. So what about password managers then? A lot of options out there. A couple different ways to look at this. There are full-featured password managers that are third-party. You pay for them on a yearly basis, usually from companies called like LastPass, 1Password, Norton, those sorts of places. Then you've got integrated password managers in different operating systems. Mac OS has what's called Keychain. You look at Android devices, they have the Google Password Manager built in. So those tend to be less full-featured, but easier to get up and running, and you may already be partially using them. Whereas the more full-featured options that you pay for are a little bit more time-consuming and a little bit more technologically challenging in some cases to get set up, but provide some additional features. So let's talk about that. What are those features on these more premium options? Some of them, and I'll talk about LastPass because I've actually used LastPass for a really long time myself, so I'm pretty familiar with it, but there are a lot of good options out there. LastPass allows you to do things like set trusted contacts for emergencies. So if something happens to you, someone else that you've designated can actually get into your password vault and get access to your things. If you've got a family or at least two people that need to share some credentials, you can do that very easily with their family plans. There's better cross-platform support on some of these systems. Like if you use a Windows computer but use iPhones, you can use LastPass or 1Password or many of these other options on all these devices, and you aren't stuck in one ecosystem. So there's some other smaller advantages. Those are the ones I see as generally the most important to people. Problem is those also have the cost and also are more difficult to get set up. So if you're someone that lives entirely in one ecosystem, whether that's Apple's ecosystem or Google's ecosystem, then in some of those cases, it's easier to use the built-in password manager. You may not get some of the other features that we talked about, but from an ease of use standpoint, these can be easier to get up and running, and you may already have some passwords in them. So you might just need to really dive in and get everything in the password manager. Keychain is fantastic. Google's integrated password manager, also fantastic. Pretty straightforward and bare bones setup on those, but they work. And what's important here is that we're able to conveniently achieve the things I talked about a few minutes ago, those 4 things on the password side. We really need to be good on the credential side. And whatever it takes for you to get there is the direction I encourage you to take on this. All right, so a couple more things on the password side. I want to talk about multi-factor authentication. You've probably heard of it, and I know you've dealt with it. This is the type of system where you get a text message code and you've got to put it in after you put your password in to make sure you are who you say you are when you sign in. MFA, also called 2FA, two-factor authentication. There is a slight difference between the two, but for purposes today, they're all multi-factor in our conversation. Highly recommend that you use multi-factor wherever it's an option. If you're prompted to turn it on, turn it on. If you've got sensitive websites where you don't already have it on, go look in your system settings or your security settings rather on those websites and see if you can turn it on. This is a great fallback in case something happens where someone gets a hold of your password and they try to sign in, they get MFA'd and asked for that code and they don't have it. So great extra layer of protection. Highly recommend that you use it everywhere that you possibly can because it really is helpful and it is that fallback that's going to help protect your accounts. So use that. Last item here is going to be the future of passwords. So passwords are hopefully going away someday. So what does that mean? So the future of passwords are going to be these things called pass keys. And in early 2024, they've already started rolling out. You've probably already seen some websites asking you to set up passwordless authentication or a pass key. Really what this is it's an attempt to replace having to put a password in every time you sign into a website and do it in a more secure manner. The way that this works is very simply put, it's based on biometrics. So say I authenticate with my phone with biometrics, Face ID, or a thumbprint. Boom, I'm into it. I go to Amazon and I want to sign in. And I have a passkey set up on Amazon. What happens is your device has this encrypted chip on it that can only be unlocked with your biometrics. That chip gets unlocked. It says, hey, Amazon, I've got half of this encryption key over here. And Amazon says, oh, okay, I've got the other half of the encryption key over here, and they match. That means that I know that you could only get to your half with biometrics, and I've got the other half for this account, which means I know who you are, who you say you are, so boom, access to that account for you. And it's very seamless and fast. This is going to be more and more common. The industry says it's going to be the end of passwords. I don't think that's going to happen for a decade probably, but it's starting now, and you're going to see it out there, so I want to make you aware of it. And if you're prompted to do it, I'd say give it a try. It doesn't get rid of your password yet, but it gives you a faster way to authenticate that's more secure, and it gives you an opportunity to give it a try as well. All right, so we've covered a lot of things so far. We're in close to the end, and I want to just take a couple of moments to talk about some of the things that we do on the Willow Creek side to secure your information and some of the things that we suggest that you do. So the first thing I like to mention is that whenever you're sending documents to us, to your advisor, tax return, whatever it might be, don't just attach those documents to an email and send them off. There's a chance that that email could be intercepted. Someone could be in your email account, something like that. We want to prevent the risk of sensitive personal information traversing email accounts. So the way that we do that is we use a service from Citrix ShareFile that you may already be familiar with, but basically it allows us to encrypt and transmit data between us to you and you to us in a way that's much more secure than just attaching it to an email. So say you have something to send to us, ask your advisor or ask us for a secure link that you can upload it to. You can also go to our website on our contact page, and you can find a secure upload link on there that you can send things to your advisor through. Use those routes rather than just attaching things to emails, and you'll see that when we send you files that have private information in them, we use that system as well. So that's just a reminder for you for those types of files. The other thing that I'd like to touch on for just a moment is wire fraud. So wire fraud has become very common, unfortunately. When we talk to the custodians, Schwab, Pershing, etc., they're telling us that they're seeing multiple cases of wire fraud every single day at their level. So this is becoming very common. A lot of this is happening through real estate or escrow type transactions where wiring instructions are being passed through email accounts. So email accounts are being compromised all the time because people aren't being very good about their credential hygiene, like we just talked about. They aren't using multi-factor, they're using weak passwords, those sorts of things. So these email accounts get compromised. And attackers will compromise a vast array of accounts, and they'll just sit in them, and they'll monitor what's going on. And eventually something interesting comes by. And that might be an email with wiring instructions. Commonly what will happen there is the attacker will swap out those instructions, and when they get sent along to the financial institution to send the wire, their instructions are actually sending the money to the attacker's bank account. And wires are verified funds. Once that money is sent, it's very hard, if not impossible, to get back, especially from a sophisticated attacker. So it's got to be prevented on the front end. So there's some standards that are, should be standards in the industry that a lot of folks are doing now, but not everyone is. So to make you aware of those, basically what we do is anytime there's new instructions from you, new banking instructions for maybe you got a new bank account, or maybe you've got wire to be sent to a new place that we don't already have on file that's verified for you, we're going to pick up the phone and call you and verbally verify that that's you. That gives us another layer of protection for you to make sure that those instructions are legitimate and they are correct and actually came from you. And we're going to go through those instructions line by line with you to make sure we're both looking at the same data and no one has changed any of that data or manipulated some way in the transaction of information. We do the same thing if there's a title company involved. So that becomes a three-way cross-check there. Call the title company, verify all that data with them. These are really good protections for preventing wire fraud, but it's good to be aware that it's out there and just be really cautious about any types of new instructions that are out there, because this is unfortunately a big risk that does exist, and it's being exploited pretty commonly now. All right, so that's a wrap. This is our cybersecurity master class here at Willow Creek. My name is Tim Admire. I hope this was helpful for you. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope there were some good takeaways here that you can walk away today and implement some of these things. This stuff is really important, and it's really important that you try to do all of these things that we talked about, or as many of them as you possibly can, because they're all additive to each other. And they're all mitigating different parts of the risk equation here that we've got in terms of cybersecurity. So we want to do everything that we can to try to keep ourselves safe out there. And these are some really good tips, I think, that will help you do that. So if you have other questions about this, definitely feel free to reach out. You can contact me directly, reach out through your advisor. Happy to sit down with you directly and do a one-on-one of the same information. We can go through what devices you actually use and talk about how to set some of this stuff up on your specific devices. Happy to answer specific questions that you have. Feel free to email me. We're always available on this stuff. Cybersecurity is a very important thing for us as an organization, and it's something that I'm really excited to be able to bring to all of you on an individual basis and help you guys just continue to remain safe out there, because it's an important topic. So thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon on this.